Damn, son, where'd you find this? Another one from King Majora, it's your boy. What's up, people? It's King Majora here. Look, so I got this new classic video for you, classic Red Pill video. So I often bring up in my rants and my other videos the logic of my epistemology and, my anti-Verecundium stance of don't trust blindly in authority. I mention all of these names such as Rockefeller Senior a lot. I mention him quite a bit, and some of the things within the mental, hygiene, cleanliness institute. And basically, this video that I'm doing is basically serving the function of showing proof from this, where I basically learned this from, and it's part of my greater project to basically read parts of literature to get people to buy these books, to actually read. I mean, I admit it, reading sucks, with all the shit on YouTube and the dopamine frying you can get on social media. It's hard to pick up a book, but that's the point of me reading it, because I want you to see just how valuable this information is. So I present to you investigative journalist Jim Mars, and we're going to first talk about the concept of the very nature of the fact that we put so much emphasis in the worth of psychology and mental health, and how we even basically organize and clump people within groups determined by their mental capacity. Are they mentally ill? Are they schizo? Or they just crazy tinfoil hatters? Or are they just straight sane minded? What does sane even mean? So we're going to get into that. So without further ado, let us begin with the psychiatry, psychology, and mental hygiene. $1 trillion conspiracy. How the New World Order, man-made diseases, and zombie banks are destroying America. By the author Jim Mars, best-selling author of The Rise of the Fourth Reich and Ruled by Secrecy. Psychiatry and eugenics. By applying psychological techniques developed by the Germans, Big Pharma, the corporate mass media, and even education have been turned into tools for mind control. But before examining how this has occurred, one must first understand the history of psychology and psychiatry. History of psychiatry. Prior to the late 1800s, the mentally ill were treated little better than torture victims, chained to the walls of basements, cages, or dungeons, beaten and subjected to therapies such as bloodletting, partial drowning, and primitive shock treatments. A change to these treatment methods came when, in the 1860s, German medical doctor Wilhelm Maximilian Wundt proposed the idea that man is simply a higher-order animal, and that feeling and emotions may be studied and altered scientifically rather than through physical punishment. Wundt's work emphasized the physiological relationship of the brain and the mind. He explored the nature of the religious beliefs denied the human soul, and began to identify mental disorders and abnormal behavior, which led to the creation of the field of psychology. His lectures on the mind of humans and animals were published in 1863, and a year later he was promoted to assistant professor of the physiology at Heidelberg University. There his work continued, and with the support of German militarists and aristocrats, he became known as the father of experimental psychology. Wundt, who found studies of the human soul incompatible with scientific empirical investigation, set out to explain what had previously been metaphysical matters in terms of mere animalistic and body chemical reactions. Many believe that Wundt's studies, as well as other European studies of the human mind, were major influences on the Nazi eugenics programs, which ultimately led to some of the greatest horrors of the 20th century. Thus, some of Germany's most learned men provided justification for Nazi euthanasia and extermination programs. Hitler's philosophy and his concept of man in general was shaped to a decisive degree by psychiatry, an influential cluster of psychiatrists, and their frightening theories and methods could collectively form the missing piece of the puzzle of Hitler. The Third Reich, the atrocities and their dreadful legacy. It is the overlooked yet utterly central piece of the puzzle, wrote Dr. Thomas Roter and his co-authors Volker Kubelis and Anthony Burwell in their 1995 book, Psychiatrists, the Men Behind Hitler. Psychology, the scientific study of the human mind, and psychiatry, the study and treatment of mental disorders, go hand in hand, and led to a viewpoint that certain people, endowed with better education and presumably understanding, were more competent to judge the behavior of others. As the field of psychiatry grew, so did its definitions, altered to the point of absurdity. In 1871, a paper was published entitled psychical degeneration of the French people, which purported that simply being French constituted a mental illness. One of psychiatry's leading figures, Richard von Krafft-Ebing, added to his list of varieties of mental disorders political and reformatory insanity, meaning any inclination to form a different opinion from that of the masses, stated Roeder, Cubilis, and Burwell. At the time of World War I, the attempt to bring respectability to the emerging psychiatric profession resulted in a certain bond that had been created between psychiatry and the aristocratic German government. The German military was particularly impressed with the treatment of Fritz Kaufmann's electroshock therapy because it helped minimize war neurosis or shell shock and quickly returned disturbed soldiers to the front. It was more of a disciplinary measure than true medical therapy. After being electrically shocked, most soldiers quickly agreed to return to service. Psychiatry continued to grow in power even as its agenda continued to widen. Psychiatrist P.J. Mobius, who had lectured on the psychological feeble-mindedness of the woman, pronounced, "The psychiatrist should be the judge about mental health because only he knows what ill means." The rush to isolate and cure mental defectives in Nazi Germany quickly was interpreted to include malcontents and dissidents opposed to Hitler's regime. This concept resulted in the Nazi Sterilization Act, which went into effect in July 1933, just 6 months after Hitler's ascension to power. This law provided for the compulsory sterilization of anyone deemed defective, deficient, or undesirable by the state. One of the leading and articulate authorities behind this act was Dr. Ernst Rudin, a psychiatrist who was in 1930 had traveled to Washington, D.C. to present a paper on the importance of eugenics and genetic and mental hygiene. It was well received by many Americans, especially among the globalists, who had come to embrace the racist and elitist views of the German philosophers, such as George Hegel, Friedrich Nietzsche, Martin Heidegger, and Rudolf Steiner. Just after Hitler took office in 1933, Rudin, by the director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, supported the law for the prevention of genetically diseased children, the initial step towards the sterilization of those deemed unworthy of life. Rudin continued to be acknowledged as a leader in psychiatry. In 1992, the prestigious Max Planck Institute praised Rudin for following his own convictions in racial hygiene measures, cooperating with the Nazis as a psychiatrist, and helping them legitimize their aims through pertinent legislation. Prescott Bush, the father and grandfather of 2 U.S. presidents, along with being a member of the Secret of Skull and Bones fraternity, was among those Yale activists promoting the Mental Hygiene Society. This organization evolved into the World Federation of Mental Health, which included the prominent Montague Norman, a former partner of Brown Brothers, governor of the Bank of England 1920 to 1944, and godfather to Nazi banker Hjalmar Schacht's grandson. Norman, himself a mental patient, appointed Brigadier General John Rawlings Rees, the former chief psychiatrist and psychological warfare expert for British intelligence, as the director of the Tavistock Psychiatric Clinic. Dr. John Rowling Rees, as a co-founder of the World Federation for Mental Health, spelled out the Federation's agenda before the annual general meeting of the National Council for Mental Hygiene on June 18, 1940. We can therefore justifiably stress our particular point of view with regard to the proper development of the human psyche. Even though our knowledge be incomplete, we must aim to make it permeate every educational activity in our national life. We have made a useful attack upon a number of professions. The 2 easiest of them naturally are the teaching professions and the church. The 2 most difficult are law and medicine. Public life, politics, and industry should all of them be within our sphere of influence. Public life, politics, and industry should all of them be within our sphere of influence. If we are to infiltrate the professional and social activities of other people, I think we must imitate the totalitarians and organize some kind of fifth column activity. If better ideas on mental health are to progress and spread, we as the salesmen must lose our identity. Let us therefore secretly be fifth columnists. Beverly K. Eekman, an author and commissioner for the Citizens Commission's Own Rights, wrote, "Colleagues of Rees, such as Canadian doctors Brock Chisholm and Ewan Cameron, progressive U.S. educators like Edward Thorndike, James Earl Russell, John Dewey, and Benjamin Bloom, and a bevy of foundations as associations and tax-supported research centers became Rees's enablers. These cadre of like-minded and self-styled experts first seized upon Russian Ivan Pavlov's classic conditioning, followed that up with German psychologist Kurt Lewing's group dynamics, Russian neuropsychologist Alexander Luria's disorganization of behavior, and the U.S. psychologist B.F. Skinner's deprivation-based operant conditioning, coupled with U.S. social psychologist Elliot Aronson's cognitive dissonance. Together, they created Rees's dream, a controlled psychological environment. Today, the Department of Defense, DoD, has a new name for it. Perception Management, PM, and the psychopharmaceutical industry has hit the jackpot. Perception management to the Department of Defense simply means getting the public to respond to as DoD officials wish without their realizing it. Knee-jerk reactions leaving reason behind is much like subliminal advertising. An early yet clear use of this technique was the name change in 1947 from the War Department to the Department of Defense. Funny, in modern context in 2026, a note, we have done that again. It's back to the Department of War. In so doing, the subject of perception management is thrust unawares into a twisted view of reality. In today's politically correct environment, this unorthodox technique is sold as an intellectual and academic freedom, explained Beverly Eakman. Similarly, encounter sessions or therapy groups are predicted on for fostering emotional toughness. Facilitators lead participants to accept ideas and deportment they would normally not tolerate. What they actually get is re-education, Soviet style. Schools of behavioral science, such as Esalen Institute and the Western Training Laboratory for Group Development, allude to consensus group thinking as being the objective. Encounters group deliberately heighten peer pressure, isolating holdouts of a viewpoint and intimidating weaker individuals by ridiculing them, cursing at them, yelling at them, and ostracizing them until they cave. Some even commit suicide. That's why the NTL, the National Training Laboratories Institute, for example, carries a disclaimer which the applicant must sign prior to admission, stating no person concerned about entering a stress situation should participate in NTL programs. A small percentage of participants have experienced stress reactions in varying degrees. There is no means of predicting such reactions or screening out or otherwise identifying those predisposed to such reactions. Now, any thoughtful person, upon reading this, would realize that the very concept of psychological screening must be a sham. If psychologists are unable to predict or screen out individuals predisposed to become upset by NTL's daunting program, then how do they expect to screen the entire population for mental illness? Yet, just such an initiative was funded by Congress in 2002, with copycat bills set for launch in several states. Could our nation's leaders be looking to avert political dissident under the pretext of preventing emotional disease? Wouldn't it be the first time? So as you can see clearly, there is an entire effort to establish this movement of psychology and create the bedrocks of establishing what we even consider to be true and what is considered to be the antithesis of true to be mental illness. And that plays a big factor in what we even consider to be true. This is the foundations of social engineering, which brings me to the next part of the video and the reading of from the same book, going into the points of Rockefeller and the philanthropy around him, Carnegie and Ford, that basically had the engineering of what I often bring up in my work and rants is the workers, not thinkers. This social engineering in the educational system and how something like that can truly affect the populace on ways we don't comprehend to this day. But we have tragically lost not only our nutsack, specifically Americans, but also we've lost the ability to reasonably think with context. So here we go. Without further ado, the next part. The $1 trillion conspiracy, how the New World Order, man-made diseases, and zombie banks are destroying America. By investigative journalist Jim Marrs, best-selling author of The Rise of the Fourth Reich and Rule by Secrecy. Dumbed down education. The aim of totalitarian education has never been to instill convictions, but to destroy the capacity to form any. Hannah Arendt, social philosopher. Education can shape the brain of any person, even a zombie. Despite public claims to the contrary, education in America is, by almost every criterion, turning younger generations into dumbed-down and ignorant zombies. Oklahoma City study. In 2009, the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs, OCPA, enlisted a national research firm, Strategic Vision, to study student knowledge of civics. The test was taken from 10 questions used by the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. Candidates for U.S. citizenship must answer 6 questions correctly in order to become citizens. According to Immigration Services data, approximately 92% of those who take the citizenship test pass on their first try. The Oklahoma students did not do as well. The results indicated that only 1 in 4 Oklahoma public high school students could name the first president of the United States. Only about 3% of the 1,000 students surveyed would have passed the citizenship test. OCPA spokesman Brandon Dutcher said that this is not just a problem in Oklahoma. According to Dutcher, Arizona students exhibited similar results. Matthew Ladner, vice president of the research at the Goldwater Institute, commented that the results of this survey are deeply troubling. Despite billions of taxpayer dollars and a set of academic standards that cover all of the material, Oklahoma high school students display an overwhelming ignorance of the institution that undergird political freedom. Those surveyed were high school students who already had completed multiple classes in social studies and history. Theoretically, if they had failed those classes, they would not have been moved into high school. But the current educational philosophy dictates that the self-esteem is more necessary than knowledge, and therefore these students were simply pass on to the next grade regardless of their aptitude for the material. material. Here are the 10 questions used in the Oklahoma study. What is the supreme law of the land? What do we call the first 10 amendments to the Constitution? What are the two parts of the U.S. Congress? How many justices are there on the Supreme Court? Who wrote the Declaration of Independence? What ocean is on the east coast of the United States? What are the two major political parties in the United States? We elect a U.S. senator for how many years? Who was the first president of the United States? Who is in charge of the executive branch? Recently, at least 26 states adopted stringent high school exit exams in an effort to promote increased learning. However, according to the New York Times, as deadlines approached for schools to start making passages of the exams a requirement for graduation, and practice tests indicated that the large numbers of students would fail, many states softened standards, delayed the requirement, or added alternative paths to a diploma. The dumbed-down condition of the schools is puzzling to many people, since it never before in history has a student population had access to such a wide variety and depth of educational resources. Yet, at the same time, never in the history of the world have students as a whole been less informed about the world, largely due to a fixation on technology and self-interest. Those citizens who grew up between the 1950s and 1970s may recall that resources for knowledge were radios and TV sets, the daily newspapers, some magazines, the library, and an occasional visit to the museum. Students now have the internet, which places at their disposal the contents of nearly 10,000 American public libraries, TV screens everywhere, in airports, restaurants, clubs, and waiting rooms, and bookstores, both chains and individually owned. Yet despite this glut of resources, when the National Association of Scholars compared a test of current college seniors to a 1955 Gallup survey of high school students, the researchers who conducted the survey found no improvement in knowledge. Why is it that the older American students get worse they perform? Asked Mark Bauerlein, a professor of English at Emory University and a director of research and analysis for the National Endowment for the Arts. Bauerlein is the author of the national bestseller, The Dumbest Generation: How the Digital Age Stupefies Young Americans and Jeopardizes Our Future. That a nation as prosperous and powerful as the United States allows young citizens to understand so little about its past and present conditions, to regard its operative laws and values so carelessly, and to patronize the best of its culture so rarely is a sad, ominous condition. Because students are actually studying only a small percentage of their total weekly time, Bauerlein posited that the basement of education cannot be blamed on schooling alone, but instead on the surrounding culture, socializing, games, and even spending habits. Bauerlein argued that the education of the young has been subverted by a culture of conformity, peer pressure, and popular culture enhanced by burgeoning technology. Once youths enter the digital realm, the race for their attention begins. And it doesn't like to stop for a half hour with a novel or a trip to the museum, Bauerlein wrote. Digital offerings don't like to share, and tales of founding fathers and ancient battles in Gothic churches can't compete with a message from a boyfriend, a photo from the party, and a new device in the Apple Store window. Dangerous teaching. The current education system seems to have forgotten about developing students' critical thinking. John Taylor Gatto, who taught school in New York City for more than 2 decades, summed up this fact of modern life in his 1992 book, Dumbing Us Down: The Hidden Curriculum of Compulsory Schooling. After teaching for some years, Gatto grew to understand that the education system does not exist to increase students' knowledge and power, but to diminish it. Bit by bit, I began to devise guerrilla exercises to allow the kids I taught, as many as I was able, the raw material people have used to educate themselves. Privacy, choice, freedom from surveillance, and as a broad range of situations and human associations as my limited power and resources could manage. What we are seeing is the psychologicalization of American education, stated an article in the April 1993 edition of Atlantic Monthly. A growing proportion of many school budgets is devoted to counseling and other psychological services. The curriculum is becoming more therapeutic. Children are taking courses in self-esteem, conflict resolution, and aggression management. Parental advisory groups are conscientiously debating alternative approaches to traditional school discipline, ranging from the teacher training and mediation to the introduction of metal detectors and security guards in the schools. Schools are increasingly becoming emergency rooms of the emotions, devoted to repairing hearts. According to Gatto, real teaching can be dangerous. Government monopoly of schools has evolved in such a way that the premise of teaching students to think for themselves jeopardizes the total institution should it spread. The occasional teacher who attempts to instill critical thinking is merely an annoyance to the chain of command. However, should what Gatto considers the central but false assumptions underlying modern education, such as the ideas that it is difficult to learn to read or that kids resist learning, many more be exposed, the ramifications could be extreme. The very stability of our economy is threatened by any form of education that might change the nature of the human product schools turn out. The economy school children currently expect to live under and serve would not survive a generation of young people trained, for example, to think critically, Gatto predicted. Over the years, I have come to see that whatever I thought I was doing as a teacher, most of which I actually was doing was teaching an invisible curriculum that reinforced the myths of the school institution and those of an economy based on caste, he added. An overview of the current educational system provoked the questions. Do younger people just wake up one morning and decide they are not interested in history, politics, or world events? Or does popular culture draw them away from classical education and critical thinking? Also, what is the invisible curriculum referred to by Gatto, and where did it come from? Perhaps a quick review of education history in America can provide the answer. Workers, not thinkers. Serious attention to education as a means of social control began in Europe and with the same minds whose philosophies led to communist and Nazi totalitarianism. Education should aim at destroying free will so that after pupils are thus schooled, they will be incapable of throughout the rest of their lives. They will be incapable throughout the rest of their lives of thinking or acting otherwise than as their schoolmasters would have wished, proclaimed Johann Gottlieb Fichte in 1810. Fichte, a teacher of philosophy and psychology at Prussian University in Berlin, was a great influence on George Hegel and other thinkers of the period. When the technique has been perfected, every government that has been in charge of education for more than one generation will be able to control its subjects securely without the need of armies or policemen. One major influence on both Adolf Hitler and Karl Marx, as well as the modern globalist, was George W. F. Hegel, whose words and works have often been appropriated to justify the means of the powerful. Hegel once said, "The state is the absolute reality, and the individual himself has objective existence, truth and morality only in his capacity as a member of the state." Hegel is also most noted for his Hegelian dialectic, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, also known as problem, reaction, solution. The globalists, however, have bastardized Hegel's mere philosophical diagram of human interaction. Rather than wait for a problem to deal with, they create the problem and then offer a draconian solution. After compromise and negotiation, they still have advanced their agenda without the opposition realizing their design. So could it be the case that Rockefeller's contributions to education were really a part of a secret agenda to create solutions for problems that didn't exist? And serious study may find that the American education establishment has been created and guided for many years by the same Hegel-inspired globalist elite who created both Russian communism and German National Socialism. See Jim Mars' Rule by Secrecy for further details. The oil magnate John D. Rockefeller Sr., whose dominant oil empire was initially funded by the Rothschild-controlled National Bank of Cleveland, created the General Education Board, GEB, in 1903 to dispense Rockefeller donations to education. By 1960, it had ceased operating as a separate entity, and its programs were rolled into the Rockefeller Foundation. And in 1917, the GEB made a $6 million grant to Columbia University to create the new Lincoln School, a private experimental co-educational school in New York City. According to school literature, the facility's predecessor was founded as Lincoln School in 1917 by the Rockefeller-funded General Education Board as a pioneer experimental school for newer educational methods, under the aegis of Columbia University's Teachers College. According to the late Eustace Mullins, the authorized biographer of poet Ezra Pound, who in 1948 encouraged Mullins to research globalist control in finances, health, and education. From this school descended the national networks of progressive educators and social scientists, whose pernicious influence closely paralleled the goals of the Communist Party, another favorite recipient of the Rockefeller millions. From its outset, the Lincoln School was described frankly as a revolutionary school for the primary and secondary schools of the entire United States. It immediately discarded all theories of education which were based on formal and well-established disciplines. That is, the McGuffey reader type of education which worked by teaching such subjects as Latin and algebra, thus teaching children to think logically about problems. Another institution of higher learning long funded by the Rockefellers in the University of Chicago and closely connected to it is the English world's most accepted authority on everything, Encyclopedia Britannica Incorporated. In 1943, advertising executive William Benton purchased the encyclopedia and operated it as a charity for the University of Chicago, eventually contributing more than $125 million to the school. From 1945 to 1953, Benton served as a senator from Connecticut after defeating Prescott Bush, the grandfather of former President George W. Bush, and was active in global affairs. Given Benton's power and influence, it is no stretch to think that his globalist beliefs could have easily permeated those things that received his benefaction. Today, the William Benton Foundation also owns Compton's Encyclopedia and Merriam-Webster Incorporated, one of the world's leading publishers of dictionaries and thesauri. Reflecting the rise of the internet coupled with a general decrease in reading today, Britannica's encyclopedia sales have precipitously dropped in recent years, yet it is still regarded as one of the most credible sources of information in the Western world. The linchpin of Rockefeller's attempt to shape modern education was his formation of the General Education Board and his continuing support of the University of Chicago. The creation and funding of the University of Chicago had done much to enhance Rockefeller's public relations profile among Baptists and educators. The only difficulty was that education on the whole wasn't in bad shape, explained Paolo Leone, author of the Leeds-Pig Connection. Leone's 1993 book traced the deleterious effects of experimental psychology on the education system back to German professor of philosophy Wilhelm Maximilian Wundt, the founder of the experimental psychology. The indigenous American education system was deeply rooted in the beliefs and practices of the Puritan Fathers, the Quakers, the early American patriots, and philosophers. Jefferson had maintained that in order to preserve liberty in the new nation, it was essential that its citizenry be educated whenever their income. Throughout the country, schools were established almost immediately after the colonialization of new areas. Leone noted educational results far exceeded those of modern schools. One has only to read old debates in the congressional record or scan the books published in the 1800s to realize that our ancestors of a century ago commanded us to use the language far superior to our own. Students learned how to read not comic books, but the essays of Burke, Webster, Lincoln, Horace, Cicero. Their difficulties with grammar were overcome long before they graduated from school, and any review of a typical elementary school arithmetic textbook printed before 1910 shows dramatically that students were learning mathematical skills that few of our current high school graduates know anything about. The high school graduate of 1900 was an educated person fluent in his language, history, and culture, possessing the skills he needed in order to succeed. According to author William H. Watkins, John D. Rockefeller Sr. was more concerned with the shaping of a new industrial social order than providing a useful education. The Rockefeller Group demonstrated how gift-giving could shape education and public policy, commented Watkins. So Rockefeller's agenda for dumbing down the population through a new education led by his GEB shows itself in a letter written by Frederick T. Gates, Rockefeller's choice to head the board. Gates wrote, "In our dreams, we have limited resources, and the people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hands. The present educational conventions fade from their minds, and unhampered by tradition, we works our own good will be upon a grateful and responsive rural folk. We shall not try to make these people or any of their children into philosophers or men of learning or men of science. We have not to raise up from among them authors, editors, poets, or men of letters. We shall not search for embryo great artists, painters, musicians, nor lawyers, doctors, preachers, politicians, statesmen, or of whom we have an ample supply. The task we set before ourselves is very simple, as well as a very beautiful one. To train these people, we find them to be perfectly ideal life just where they are. So we will organize our children and teach them to do in a perfect way the things their fathers and mothers are doing in an imperfect way, in the homes and the shops on the farm." As recent as 1973, psychiatrist Dr. Chester M. Pierce, speaking at a childhood international educational seminar, echoed Gates' condescending arrogance, but went even further by proclaiming every child in America entering school at the age of 5 is insane because he comes to school with certain allegiances to our founding fathers, towards our elected officials, towards his parents, towards a belief in a supernatural being, towards the sovereignty of this nation as a separate entity. It's up to you teachers to make all of these sick children well by creating the international children of the future. Of Gates's letter, Leone stated that while it would be false to say John D. Rockefeller was a mastermind of international intrigue and deception, it would not be false to say that Rockefeller money has been used in various ways to forward social and global control through economic foundations, the United Nations, universities, banking, industry, medicine, and of course, education, psychology, and psychiatry. That's a tremendous amount of control and involvement for one group, noted Leone, who then asked, what if the theories and practices they funded and continue to fund are fundamentally flawed and don't lead to the best possible situations in the various fields mentioned? Well, the views in most of those areas are fundamentally flawed, and they don't lead to the best solutions in mental health, education, medicine, sanity, and happiness, original emphasis. But for most likely, despite all humanitarian posturing, they were never intended to. Other Rockefeller-connected entities that still shape society in the United States include the Brookings Institution, the National Bureau of Education or Economic Research, the National Bureau of Economic Research, the Public Administration Clearinghouse, the Council of State Governments, and the Institute of Pacific Relations. Paul Volcker, a former Rockefeller assistant, was named the chairman of the U.S. Bank, the Federal Reserve System, during the Carter administration and served there until 1987. Norman Dodd, now deceased, who was the director of research in 1953 to 1954 for the House of Select Committee to investigate foundations and comparable organizations, reported that in 1952, the president of the Ford Foundation, part of the globalist syndicate working for financial, educational, and political control, told him bluntly that operating under a directive from the White House, his foundation was to use our grant-making power so as to alter the life in the United States that we could comfortably merge with the Soviet Union. Now, with the collapse of communism and the advent of the United Nations, NATO, and other economic treaties, it seems like this globalist goal is close to becoming realized. Dodd also stated that the congressional investigation found that Guggenheim, Ford, and Rockefeller Foundations and the Carnegie Endowment were working in harmony to control education in the United States, adding that these entities had been subverted from the original goals of their creators by subsequent directors, either working for or indoctrinated by the globalists. This is yet another example of wealth taking control of existing organizations. Some of the past and current organizations and foundations that have led to an impact on American education and that are linked by membership or funding to the globalist plutocracy include the Agency of International Development, American Civil Liberties Union, American Council of Race Relations, American Press Institute, Anti-Defamation League, Arab Bureau, Aspen Institute, Association of Humanistic Psychology, Mattel Memorial Institute, Center for Advanced Studies in the Behavioral Sciences, Center for Constitutional Rights, Center for Cuban Studies, Center for Democratic Institutions, Christian Socialist League, Communist League, Environmental Fund, Fabian Society, Ford Foundation, Foundation for National Progress, German Marshall Fund, Hudson Institute, Institute for Pacific Relations, Institute on Drugs, Crime, and Justice, International Institute for Strategic Studies, Mellon Institute, Metaphysical Society, Milner Group, Mont Pelerin Society, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, National Council of Churches, New World Foundation, Ayn Rand Institute, Stanford Research Institute, Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, Union of Concerned Scientists, International Red Cross, and the YMCA. According to Beverly Eekman, a former educator, government speechwriter, and author of Walking Targets, How Our Psychologized Classrooms Are Producing a Nation of Sitting Ducks, Foundation subsidized educators like G. Stanley Hall, Abraham Flexner, John Gardner, Theodore Sizer, Ronald Havelock, John Goodlad, Benjamin Bloom, and Ralph Tyler brought to the classroom the psychology principles of the World Federation of Mental Health. For openers, they worked to ensure a school curriculum and testing ditched the traditional focus on excellence in academics to concentrate on a subjective socialization, i.e. socialist, agenda that targeted the children's belief systems. To illustrate the radical nature of this step, one needs only quote from the father of modern education, John Dewey. In his acclaimed book, School and Society, he wrote, "There is no obvious social motive for the acquiring of learning and no clear social gain at success thereat." Fast forward to 1981 and to the father of outcome-based education, Benjamin Bloom. In All Our Children Learning, Bloom averred that the purpose of education is to change the thoughts, feelings, and actions of students by challenging the students' fixed beliefs. Eekman pointed to one example of how perceptions can be judged. Brugman's individualism is expression nobody hears much anymore, but folks used to hear it with regularity, she noted. Rugged individualism encompassed a range of characteristics: independence, self-sufficiency, thinking for oneself. In the 1970s, the axe was laid to all three. Negative terminologies like loner and misfit redefined the individualist. Independence was scrapped for independency, self-sufficiency for redistribution, and thinking for oneself was equated with intolerance. Today, any close reading of the newspaper reminds us daily that the loner requires psychiatric intervention and maybe drugs as well. By 1989, the much ballyhooed paradigm shift, as it was dubbed by behaviorist educrats, occurred in American schools, and the free world was hurled into freefall. Clandestine censorship, counselors in universities and dorms, and counter-style techniques masquerading as class discussions in high schools, massive invasions of privacy under the cover of academic testing, value-neutral courses in ethics and the world history that bestowed upon even the most heinous regimes the moral equivalence of Jeffersonian democracy. Little wonder that by the 1990s, battalions of psychiatrists were being dispatched to every school district to help contain the new brand of war games, a tsunami of school shootings and mass murders perpetuated by kids raised on a diet of behavior modification and psychiatric drugs. The changing of a student's beliefs, or behavior modification, is a technique long studied by the CIA and other agencies seeking methods of mind control. It should be obvious that to modify anyone's behavior, first one must find out what people, preferably children, are thinking and set about changing any offending attitudes. It has been well documented in a number of books and articles that the United States Intelligence Committee has heavily influenced the American education system to propagate its views and philosophies. David N. Gibbs, an associate professor of political science at the University of Arizona, believes that influence is always supported by the distribution of money, he wrote. While pundits never tire of the cliche that American universities are dominated by leftist faculty who are hostile towards the objectives of established foreign policies, the reality is altogether different. The CIA has become a growing force on campus, according to a recent article in the Wall Street Journal. The agency finds it needs experts from academia and colleges pressed for cash like their revenue. Long-standing academic inhibition about being publicly associated with the CIA have largely disappeared. In 2002, former CIA Director Robert Gates became president of Texas A&M University, while the new president of Arizona State University, Michael Crow, was vice chairman of the agency's venture capital arm, In-Q-Tel Inc. The CIA has created a special scholarship program for graduate students able to and willing to obtain security clearances. According to the London Guardian, the primary purposes of the program is to promote disciplines that would be of use to intelligence agencies. And throughout the country, academics in several disciplines are undertaking research, often secret, from the CIA. The Constitution never states that the federal government should control education. Education should never be the responsibility of the federal government, but of the parent and the local educators. Many people see government as a means to control education by selecting what to teach and what alternative theories to suppress. Many parents fear brainwashing in public or private schools. They look to schools to teach their children to be open-minded, to be able to read and write, and to fully understand the Constitution. Yet schools have often fallen short of what parents have seemed to embrace what John D. Rockefeller Sr. wanted. He is often quoted as saying, "I don't want a nation of thinkers, I want a nation of workers." A 2006 report by the Federation of American Scientists seemed to echo Rockefeller's request for workers over thinkers by arguing for increased use of video games in the classroom. The report said, The report said workforce globalization is rapidly expanding. The United States cannot compete in this highly connected system of global commerce on the basis of low wages, commodity products, and standardized services. It must compete by taking the lead in the next generation of knowledge creation technologies, products, and services, business models, and dynamic management systems. When individuals play modern video and computer games, they experience environments in which they often must master the kinds of high-order thinking and decision-making skills employers seek today. Others, such as author Beverly Eekman, contest the ideas that such games can truly prepare young persons for the workplace. Given the man behind America's education history and the mind-numbing curriculum they produce that is now used by teachers, it becomes understandable why our entire educational system merely turns out young people prepared for either wage slavery or to become teachers. The late author and media critic Neil Postman wrote, "In order to understand what kind of behaviors classrooms promote, one must become accustomed to observing what, in fact, students actually do in them. What students do in a classroom is what they learn, as John Dewey would say, and what they learn to do is the classroom's message, as media commentator Marshall McLuhan would say. Now, what is that students do in the classroom? Well, mostly they sit and listen to the teacher. Mostly they are required to believe in authorities, or at least pretend to such belief when they take tests. Mostly they are required to remember original emphasis. They are almost never required to make observations, formulate definitions, or perform any intellectual operations that go beyond repeating what someone else says is true. They are rarely encouraged to ask substantive questions, although they are permitted to ask about administrative and technical details. How long should the paper be? Does spelling count? When is the assignment due? It is practically unheard of for students to play any role in determining what problems are worth studying or what procedures of inquiry ought to be used. Examine the types of questions teachers ask in classrooms, and you will find that most of them are what might technically be called convergent questions, but what might more simply be called guess what I am thinking questions. Postman and his co-author Charles Weingartner concluded that in their book Teaching as a Subversive Activity that contemporary curriculums are designed as a distraction to prevent students from knowing themselves and the world about them, and the deficiencies of a weakened educational system are passed along to future teachers. It starts almost immediately, noted the two authors, because the teachers have been victims, in this case for almost 16 years, of this kind of schooling we have described as producing intellectual paraplegics. The college students, future teachers we are now talking about are the ones who were most successful in conventional school terms. That is, they are the ones who learned the best what they were required to do, to sit quietly, to accept without question whatever nonsense was inflicted on them, to ventriloquize on demand with a high degree of fidelity, to go down only on the down staircase, to speak only on signal from the teacher, and so on. All during these 16 years, they learned not to think, not to ask questions, not to figure things out for themselves. They learned to become totally dependent on teacher authority, and they learned it with dedication. So, I hope you can understand now with everything that I brought up, right? So I often bring this up in my rants, and be sure to like and subscribe, follow wherever you are at it. I would appreciate this dearly. Repost, however you got to do it, baby. But listen, so, basically, I'm like, what you've heard, it's clearly, it should make you think about everything we even take into consideration today at all. The UFO discussion, the politics, Donald Trump, the Republicans, Democrats, the JQ, the Roman question, the Vatican question, any question really, what we even deem worthy to call credible information solely depends upon this more or less cabal or basically oligarchy of financial institutions, philanthropy, and ambitions to create a drone class of worker stock humans, basically, that are nothing but cattle, and more or less we've become that. And our dopamine fried and terminally online world, and the way we take certain things so seriously with our peer pressure echo chambers of what we even deem to be socially acceptable culture. How I've described God of War as consumerist slop in the media telling you a different story every time when you've eaten up that Kratos is deep every time. It's the same thing, people. But yeah, that's basically what I've been, discussing in my videos, and I wanted to have proof in a red pill video, the documentary aspect, so you can at least see where I'm coming from with it, and you can get more names, more institutions, and before he passed away, Jim Marrs was, considered, a damn good investigative journalist despite the crazy information and the age that he, basically was a best-selling author. So, I don't know. So I hope you liked this video. Like I said, be sure to like and subscribe wherever you are at. So that's all. Peace out.